What would you do if you saw a 12-year-old kid being tossed by a police officer just because of the color of his skin? Would you stand by and watch, or would you do something about it? This is the shocking story of young Marcus Johnson, a bright, kind-hearted boy whose life changed forever one fateful afternoon. But before we dive into the details, make sure to like and subscribe to this channel for more gripping stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Now let's get into it. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the quiet suburban neighborhood of Maplewood. The streets were calm, the kind of calm that makes you feel safe, like nothing bad could ever happen here. But that calm was about to be shattered. Marcus Johnson, a 12-year-old boy with a love for basketball and a smile that could light up a room, was walking home from the park. He had just finished playing a game with his friends, and his mind was filled with dreams of one day playing in the NBA. Marcus was the kind of kid who always looked out for others, the one who would share his lunch if someone forgot theirs or help a friend with their homework even if it meant staying up late. He was the pride of his family, the youngest of 3 siblings, and the apple of his mother's eye. But on this particular evening, Marcus's life was about to take a turn he could never have imagined. As he turned the corner onto his street, he noticed a police car slowly cruising behind him. He didn't think much of it at first. After all, he hadn't done anything wrong. But then the car sped up, and the officer inside rolled down his window. "Hey you, stop right there," the officer barked, his voice harsh and commanding. Marcus froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned around slowly, his hands instinctively going up in the air. "Me?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Yes, you. What are you doing out here?" the officer demanded, stepping out of the car. He was a tall, burly man with a stern face and a badge that gleamed in the fading sunlight. His name was Officer Greg Harris, a veteran cop with a reputation for being tough on crime. But there was something in his eyes that made Marcus feel uneasy, something that sent a chill down his spine. "I'm just going home, sir," Marcus replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I live right down the street." Officer Harris narrowed his eyes, his hand resting on the taser at his side. "You expect me to believe that? You fit the description of a suspect we're looking for. A black male, around your age, involved in a robbery earlier today." Marcus's eyes widened in shock. "I didn't do anything, sir. I was at the park with my friends. You can ask them." But Officer Harris wasn't listening. He took a step closer, his hand tightening on the taser. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," he ordered. Marcus felt a surge of panic. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but he also knew that arguing with a police officer could make things worse. He turned around slowly, his hands shaking as he placed them behind his back. But before he could say another word, he felt a sharp, searing pain shoot through his body. Officer Harris had tossed him. Marcus collapsed to the ground, his body convulsing as the electricity coursed through him. He couldn't scream, couldn't move, couldn't do anything but lie there, helpless. As the world around him faded to black, Marcus heard the sound of voices shouting, of people running towards him. But he couldn't make out what they were saying. All he could think about was how unfair this was, how he had done nothing wrong, and yet here he was lying on the ground, being treated like a criminal. And then everything went dark. But what happened next? What led to this shocking moment? And how did Marcus end up in this situation? To understand that, we need to go back to the beginning, to the events that set this tragic chain of events in motion. Marcus Johnson was born and raised in Maplewood, a small town where everyone knew everyone else. His father, James Johnson, worked long hours as a mechanic, while his mother, Linda Johnson, was a nurse at the local hospital. They were a hard-working family, the kind that believed in the American dream and did everything they could to give their children a better life. Marcus was the youngest of 3 siblings. His older brother, Michael, was in college studying to be an engineer, while his sister, Jasmine, was a high school senior with dreams of becoming a doctor. Marcus looked up to both of them, but he had his own dreams too. He wanted to be a professional basketball player, and he spent every spare moment practicing his shots and perfecting his dribble. But despite his dreams, Marcus was also a realist. He knew that being a black kid in America came with its own set of challenges. His parents had taught him to always be respectful, to keep his hands visible, and to never argue with the police. They had given him the talk, the one that every black parent gives their child, about how to survive in a world that often saw them as a threat. But even with all that preparation, nothing could have prepared Marcus for what happened that day. It all started with a simple trip to the park. Marcus had gone there with his friends, as he often did after school. They had played a few games of basketball, laughed, and joked around just like any other day. But as they were leaving, Marcus noticed a group of older kids hanging out near the entrance. They looked rough, the kind of kids his parents had warned him about, but Marcus didn't think much of it. He just kept walking, his mind already on the homework he had to do when he got home. But as he turned the corner onto his street, he saw the police car. At first, he thought it was just passing by, but then it slowed down, and the officer inside started staring at him. Marcus felt a knot form in his stomach, but he told himself not to worry. He hadn't done anything wrong. He was just a kid walking home. But then the officer called out to him, and everything changed. As Marcus lay on the ground, his body still trembling from the taser, he heard the sound of footsteps running towards him. He tried to open his eyes, but everything was blurry. He could hear voices, but they sounded distant, like they were coming from another world. "What the hell are you doing?" "He's just a kid," someone shouted. Marcus recognized the voice. It was his neighbor, Mr. Thompson, an elderly man who had always been kind to him. Mr. Thompson was standing over him, his face red with anger as he confronted Officer Harris. "Stay out of this, old man," Officer Harris snapped. "This is police business." "Police business? You just tossed a 12-year-old boy for no reason." Mr. Thompson shot back. "I saw the whole thing. He wasn't doing anything wrong." But Officer Harris wasn't listening. He was too busy trying to justify his actions, too busy trying to convince himself that he had done the right thing. But deep down, he knew he hadn't. He knew he had let his biases get the better of him, and now a young boy was paying the price. As the crowd grew larger, more people started to speak up. They had seen what had happened, and they weren't going to let it slide. They demanded answers, demanded justice for Marcus. But Officer Harris wasn't ready to back down. He was a man who was used to being in control, and he wasn't about to let a bunch of civilians tell him what to do. But as the tension grew, something unexpected happened. A woman pushed her way through the crowd, her face a mask of fury. It was Marcus's mother, Linda Johnson. She had been at work when she got the call, and she had rushed home as fast as she could. "What did you do to my son?" she screamed, her voice shaking with anger and fear. Officer Harris tried to explain, but Linda wasn't having it. She knelt down beside Marcus, her hands trembling as she checked his pulse. He was alive, but barely. His breathing was shallow, and his skin was pale. "You're going to pay for this," Linda said, her voice low and dangerous. "I don't care who you are or what badge you wear. You hurt my son, and you're going to pay." But what happened next? Did Officer Harris face justice for his actions? Did Marcus recover from the trauma of being tossed? And what about the community? How did they respond to this shocking incident? To find out, stay tuned for the next chapter. But before you go, make sure to like and subscribe to this channel for more gripping stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. And remember, this is just the beginning. The story of Marcus Johnson is far from over. End of Chapter 1. Proceed to the next chapter, but note, don't keep adding CTA, and stay tuned for the next chapter at the end of every chapter. Chapter 2. The chaos on Maplewood Street was far from over. Marcus's limp body lay on the ground, his mother Linda kneeling beside him, her hands trembling as she brushed his hair away from his face. Her heart was racing, her mind a whirlwind of fear and anger. She looked up at Officer Harris, her eyes blazing with a mixture of desperation and fury. "What did you do to my son?" she repeated, her voice cracking under the weight of her emotions. Officer Harris stood frozen, his face pale, but his jaw clenched. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The crowd around him was growing louder, their voices a cacophony of outrage and disbelief. People were recording the scene on their phones, their cameras capturing every detail of the confrontation. Mr. Thompson, Marcus's elderly neighbor, stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with authority. "You need to call an ambulance right now," he said, pointing at Officer Harris. "This boy needs medical attention, and you need to answer for what you've done." Officer Harris hesitated for a moment, then reached for his radio. "Dispatch, I need an ambulance at the corner of Maplewood and 5th Street. Possible juvenile injury. His voice was shaky, a stark contrast to the commanding tone he had used just moments earlier. As the crowd continued to murmur, Linda cradled Marcus's head in her lap, whispering soothing words to him, even though he was unconscious. "You're going to be okay, baby. Mama's here. Just hold on, okay? Just hold on." The sound of sirens grew louder in the distance, and within minutes, an ambulance arrived. Paramedics rushed to Marcus's side, their movements quick and efficient as they assessed his condition. They carefully lifted him onto a stretcher and loaded him into the ambulance, Linda climbing in after them. As the ambulance sped away, the crowd turned their attention back to Officer Harris. He stood there, his hands on his hips, trying to maintain an air of authority, but it was clear that he was shaken. The people of Maplewood weren't going to let this go. They had seen what had happened, and they wanted answers. Meanwhile, at Maplewood General Hospital, Marcus was rushed into the emergency room. Doctors and nurses worked tirelessly to stabilize him, their faces grim as they monitored his vital signs. Linda sat in the waiting room, her hands clasped tightly together as she prayed for her son's recovery. Her husband, James, arrived shortly after, his face etched with worry. He had been at work when he got the call, and he had rushed to the hospital as fast as he could. When he saw Linda, he pulled her into a tight embrace, his voice trembling as he asked, "How is he? Is he going to be okay?" Linda shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know, James. I don't know." The hours dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. Finally, a doctor emerged from the emergency room and approached the Johnsons. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson," he began, his tone cautious but reassuring. "Marcus is stable. He suffered a severe shock from the taser, but he's going to be okay. We're keeping him overnight for observation, but he should make a full recovery." Linda let out a sob of relief, clutching James's arm for support. "Can we see him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The doctor nodded. "Of course. He's still unconscious, but you can sit with him." As the Johnsons sat by Marcus's bedside, the events of the day replayed in their minds. They couldn't understand how something like this could happen to their son. He was just a kid, a good kid who had never been in trouble a day in his life. How could a police officer mistake him for a criminal? How could he tase a 12-year-old boy? But while the Johnsons grappled with their emotions, the rest of Maplewood was already in an uproar. The videos of the incident had gone viral, spreading like wildfire across social media. People were outraged, demanding justice for Marcus and accountability for Officer Harris. The local news stations picked up the story, and by the next morning, it was the lead story on every channel. Reporters descended on Maplewood, interviewing witnesses and trying to piece together what had happened. The police department held a press conference, promising a full investigation into the incident, but their words did little to calm the growing anger in the community. Back at the hospital, Marcus began to stir. His eyes fluttered open, and he looked around, confused and disoriented. "Mama," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Linda leaned over him, her face lighting up with relief. "I'm here, baby. I'm right here." Marcus tried to sit up, but Linda gently pushed him back down. "Take it easy, sweetheart. You're in the hospital. You're safe now." Marcus's eyes widened as the memories of what had happened came flooding back. "The police officer. He tossed me," he said, his voice trembling. "I didn't do anything wrong, Mama. I swear I didn't." Linda's heart broke as she listened to her son. She reached out and took his hand, squeezing it tightly. "I know, baby. I know you didn't. We're going to make this right. Okay? We're going to fight for you." But as the Johnsons began to process what had happened, they knew that their fight was just beginning. The incident had sparked a fire in Maplewood, and the community was demanding change. Protests were being organized, and people were calling for Officer Harris to be held accountable. The Johnsons knew that they couldn't do this alone. They needed help, and they needed it fast. They reached out to a local civil rights attorney, a woman named Sarah Mitchell, who had a reputation for taking on tough cases. Sarah listened to their story, her face growing more and more serious as they spoke. "This is a clear case of racial profiling and excessive force," she said, her voice firm. "We're going to make sure that Officer Harris is held accountable for what he did to Marcus." But this isn't just about one officer. This is about a system that allows this kind of thing to happen. We're going to fight for justice, not just for Marcus, but for every kid who's ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. As the Johnsons prepared to take on the fight of their lives, they couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. They knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but they also knew that they weren't alone. The community was behind them, and they were determined to see this through to the end. But as they left the hospital that night, they couldn't shake the feeling that something even bigger was coming. The incident had opened old wounds in Maplewood, wounds that had never fully healed. And as the protests grew louder and the tension in the town reached a boiling point, it was clear that this was just the beginning. The protests began the very next day. By sunrise, a crowd had gathered outside the Maplewood Police Department, their signs held high and their voices echoing through the streets. "Justice for Marcus," they chanted, their anger and frustration palpable. The incident had struck a nerve, not just in Maplewood but across the country. People were tired of seeing black children treated like criminals, tired of the excuses, tired of the lack of accountability. Among the protesters was Marcus's older brother, Michael. He had driven home from college as soon as he heard what had happened, his heart heavy with worry and rage. Standing beside him was his sister, Jasmine, her face set in a determined expression. They had both grown up in Maplewood, a town they had always thought of as safe. But now, they weren't so sure. "This isn't just about Marcus," Michael said, addressing the crowd. "This is about every black kid who's ever been treated like a threat just because of the color of their skin. We can't let this keep happening. We have to stand up and fight for what's right." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices rising in unison. But not everyone was on their side. Across the street, a small group of counter-protesters had gathered, their signs defending Officer Harris and accusing the protesters of being anti-police. The tension between the two groups was thick, and it was only a matter of time before things escalated. Meanwhile, inside the police station, Officer Harris sat in a small interrogation room, his hands clasped tightly together. He had been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation, but he knew that his career, and possibly his freedom, was on the line. Across from him sat Internal Affairs investigator, Detective Laura Bennett, her expression unreadable as she flipped through a file. "Officer Harris," she began, her voice calm but firm, "I need you to walk me through what happened yesterday. Start from the beginning." Harris took a deep breath, his mind racing as he tried to piece together his story. "I was on patrol when I got a call about a robbery in the area. The suspect was described as a black male, around 12 years old, wearing a red hoodie. When I saw Marcus, he matched the description. I thought he was the suspect." Detective Bennett raised an eyebrow. "Did you ask him any questions before you tossed him?" Harris hesitated, his eyes darting around the room. I told him to stop and put his hands behind his back. But he didn't comply. I thought he was reaching for something, so I acted in self-defense." Bennett leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "Officer Harris, Marcus Johnson is 12 years old. He was walking home from the park. There was no evidence that he was involved in any crime. Do you really believe that tossing him was justified?" Harris opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He knew that his actions were indefensible, but he couldn't bring himself to admit it. Instead, he sat in silence, his mind racing as he tried to figure out how to salvage the situation. Back at the hospital, Marcus was finally discharged. His parents helped him into the car, their faces filled with relief, but also worry. They knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but they were determined to support their son every step of the way. As they drove home, Marcus stared out the window, his mind still reeling from everything that had happened. He had always trusted the police, had always believed that they were there to protect him. But now, he wasn't so sure. The memory of the taser, the pain, the fear, it was all too much. "Mama," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why did he do that to me? I didn't do anything wrong." Linda reached back and took his hand, her heart breaking at the pain in his voice. "I don't know, baby," she said, her voice trembling. "But we're going to make sure that he pays for what he did. We're going to fight for you, okay?" Marcus nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in his chest. He knew that his life would never be the same, that this incident would follow him for the rest of his life. But he also knew that he had to be strong, not just for himself, but for his family. When they arrived home, they were greeted by a crowd of neighbors and friends, all of whom had come to show their support. They hugged Marcus, telling him how brave he was and how proud they were of him. But amidst the love and support, there was also an undercurrent of anger, a determination to see justice served. As the day wore on, the protests outside the police station grew louder. The crowd had swelled to hundreds, their voices rising in unison as they demanded accountability. But as the sun began to set, the tension reached a boiling point. A group of counter-protesters tried to push their way through the crowd, their voices filled with anger and hostility. "Go home," one of them shouted, shoving a protester. "You're just causing trouble." The protester shoved back, and within seconds, the situation escalated into a full-blown brawl. Police officers rushed in, trying to break up the fight, but it was too late. The streets of Maplewood had become a battleground, the anger and frustration of the community spilling over into violence. As the chaos unfolded, Marcus and his family watched from their living room, their hearts heavy with fear and sadness. They had hoped that the protests would bring about change, but now, it seemed like things were only getting worse. "What's going to happen now?" Marcus asked, his voice filled with worry. James put a hand on his son's shoulder, his expression grim. "I don't know, son," he said, "but no matter what happens, we're going to get through this together. We're a family, and we stick together, no matter what." But as the night wore on, it became clear that the fight was far from over. The protests had sparked a movement, one that was spreading far beyond the borders of Maplewood. People across the country were watching, their eyes on this small town as it grappled with issues of race, justice, and accountability. And as the Johnsons prepared for the next chapter in their fight, they couldn't help but wonder what the future held. Would they be able to find justice for Marcus? Or would the system continue to fail them, as it had failed so many others? The morning after the protests turned violent, Maplewood was a town on edge. The streets were littered with debris from the clashes, broken signs, shattered glass, and the remnants of tear gas canisters. News vans lined the sidewalks, reporters speaking into cameras as they recounted the chaos that had unfolded the night before. The national spotlight was now firmly fixed on Maplewood, and the pressure was mounting. Inside the Johnson household, the mood was somber. Marcus sat at the kitchen table, picking at a plate of food he had no appetite for. His parents and siblings moved around him, their faces etched with worry. The events of the past few days had taken a toll on all of them, but they knew they couldn't afford to give up. "Not now. We need to stay strong," James said, breaking the silence. "This isn't just about us anymore. It's about everyone who's ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. We have to keep fighting." Linda nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "James is right. We got the whole country watching us now. We can't let them down." Marcus looked up at his parents, his young face filled with a mix of fear and resolve. "What can I do?" he asked quietly. "I don't want to just sit here. I want to help." Linda reached over and squeezed his hand. "You've already done so much, baby. Just by being here, by being strong, you're helping. But if you want to do more, we'll find a way." Meanwhile, at the Maplewood Police Department, the atmosphere was tense. Chief of Police Daniel Reynolds sat in his office, his head in his hands as he reviewed the latest reports. The protests, the violence, the national media attention. It was all a nightmare he hadn't seen coming. And at the center of it all was Officer Greg Harris, a man whose actions had sparked a firestorm. There was a knock on the door, and Detective Laura Bennett stepped in, her expression grim. "Chief, we need to talk about Harris," she said, closing the door behind her. "The evidence is clear. He acted recklessly, and he needs to be held accountable." Reynolds sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "I know, Laura, but this isn't just about Harris. This is about the entire department. If we throw him under the bus, it's going to look like we're admitting fault. And if we don't, the public is going to tear us apart." Bennett leaned forward, her voice firm. "With all due respect, Chief, the public already is tearing us apart. The only way to fix this is to do the right thing. Harris needs to be fired, and he needs to face criminal charges. If we don't act now, This is only going to get worse. Reynolds nodded slowly, his mind racing. He knew she was right, but he also knew that the decision he made would have far-reaching consequences. All right, he said finally, draft the paperwork. Harris is done, and let's get the DA's office involved. If there's enough evidence to charge him, we'll cooperate fully. As the police department prepared to take action, the Johnsons were meeting with their attorney, Sarah Mitchell, to discuss their next steps. Sarah had been working around the clock, gathering evidence and building a case against Officer Harris and the Maplewood Police Department. We're filing a civil rights lawsuit, Sarah explained, spreading out a stack of papers on the Johnsons' dining room table. We're going after Harris for excessive force and racial profiling, and we're going after the department for failing to properly train and supervise their officers. This is about more than just Marcus. This is about sending a message that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated. James and Linda exchanged a glance, their faces filled with a mix of hope and apprehension. What are our chances? James asked. I mean, we're just a regular family. How are we supposed to take on the police? Sarah smiled, her confidence unwavering. You're not just a regular family. You're a family that's standing up for what's right. And you've got the entire community and the country behind you. We're going to win this, James. I promise you that. As the day wore on, the news broke that Officer Greg Harris had been fired and was facing criminal charges. The announcement sent shockwaves through Maplewood, with some people celebrating the decision and others condemning it. The protests continued, but the mood shifted slightly, with many people feeling like they had won a small victory. But for Marcus, the news brought little comfort. He sat in his room, staring at the walls as he tried to process everything that had happened. He had always been a happy, carefree kid, but now he felt like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. There was a knock on his door, and Jasmine stepped in, her face filled with concern. Hey, little bro, she said softly, sitting down on the edge of his bed. How are you holding up? Marcus shrugged, his eyes downcast. I don't know. I feel like everything's changed, you know? Like I can't just be a kid anymore. Jasmine reached out and ruffled his hair, a small smile on her face. I know it feels that way, but you're still you, Marcus. You're still the same awesome kid who loves basketball and makes everyone laugh. This doesn't define you, okay? You're so much more than what happened. Marcus looked up at his sister, his eyes filled with gratitude. Thanks, Jazz. I needed to hear that. But as the Johnsons tried to find moments of peace amidst the chaos, they knew that the fight was far from over. The lawsuit was just the beginning, and they had no idea what challenges lay ahead. The road to justice was long and difficult, and they would need every ounce of strength and determination to see it through. And as the sun set on Maplewood, the town remained divided, its people grappling with questions of race, justice, and accountability. The story of Marcus Johnson had become a symbol of a much larger struggle, one that would continue to unfold in the days and weeks to come. The days following Officer Harris's firing were a whirlwind of activity. The national media descended on Maplewood, turning the small town into a focal point for discussions about police brutality, racial profiling, and systemic racism. Everywhere the Johnsons went, cameras followed, and reporters shouted questions. It was overwhelming, but the family tried to stay focused on their goal, justice for Marcus. One evening, as the family gathered in their living room, Sarah Mitchell arrived with an update on the lawsuit. She carried a thick folder of documents and a determined expression. We've got a court date, she announced, setting the folder on the coffee table. The judge has agreed to fast-track the case given the public interest. That means we'll be in court in 2 weeks. Linda's eyes widened. 2 weeks? That's so soon. Are we ready? Sarah nodded confidently. We're as ready as we'll ever be. I've been working with a team of investigators, and we've gathered a mountain of evidence. Witness statements, video footage, and even internal police documents that show a pattern of misconduct. We're going to make sure the world sees the truth. James leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. And what about Marcus? Will he have to testify? Sarah's expression softened. Yes, he will. I know it's a lot to ask of him, but his testimony is crucial. The jury needs to hear directly from him about what happened that day. But don't worry, we'll prepare him. He won't be alone up there. Marcus, who had been quietly listening from the corner of the couch, spoke up. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "I want to tell them what happened. I want them to know the truth." Linda reached over and squeezed his hand, her heart swelling with pride. "That's my brave boy," she said, her voice thick with emotion. As the days counted down to the trial, the Johnsons worked closely with Sarah to prepare. They spent hours going over the details of the case, rehearsing questions, and discussing strategy. It was exhausting, but they knew it was necessary. They also leaned on their community for support. Neighbors brought meals, friends offered words of encouragement, and strangers from across the country sent letters and messages of solidarity. But not everyone in Maplewood was on their side. The town remained deeply divided, with some people accusing the Johnsons of stirring up trouble and others defending Officer Harris. Tensions ran high, and there were moments when it felt like the entire community was on the brink of another explosion. One afternoon, as Marcus and his siblings walked home from the park, they were confronted by a group of teenagers. The teens, who were clearly supporters of Officer Harris, shouted insults and taunts, their faces twisted with anger. "Why are you lying about what happened?" one of them yelled. "You're just trying to make cops look bad." Marcus froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to respond, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. Thankfully, Michael stepped in, his voice calm but firm. "Back off," he said, standing protectively in front of his younger siblings. "You don't know what you're talking about." The teens hesitated, clearly intimidated by Michael's presence, and eventually walked away, muttering under their breath. But the encounter left Marcus shaken. He had always felt safe in his neighborhood, but now he wasn't so sure. As the trial date approached, the pressure continued to mount. The media coverage intensified, with pundits and analysts debating the case on national television. Some argued that Officer Harris had been unfairly scapegoated, while others praised the Johnsons for their courage in standing up to systemic injustice. The night before the trial, the family gathered for a quiet dinner. The atmosphere was tense, but there was also a sense of determination. They knew that the next few days would be grueling, but they also knew that they were fighting for something bigger than themselves. "No matter what happens," James said, looking around the table at his family, "I want you all to know how proud I am of you. We've been through so much, but we've stuck together. And that's what matters." Linda nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "We're a family," she said, "and we're going to get through this together." The morning of the trial arrived, and the courthouse was packed. Reporters, activists, and curious onlookers filled the halls, all eager to catch a glimpse of the proceedings. The Johnsons arrived early, accompanied by Sarah and a small group of supporters. They were greeted by a mix of cheers and jeers, but they tried to block out the noise and focus on the task at hand. As they entered the courtroom, Marcus felt a wave of anxiety wash over him. The room was imposing, with its high ceilings, wooden benches, and stern-faced judge. He took a deep breath, reminding himself why he was there. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for every kid who had ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. The trial began with opening statements. Sarah stood before the jury, her voice clear and confident as she outlined the case against Officer Harris and the Maplewood Police Department. "This is a story about a 12-year-old boy who was targeted because of the color of his skin," she said. "A boy who was treated like a criminal simply for existing. But this is also a story about courage, about a family who refused to stay silent in the face of injustice. And it's a story about accountability, about holding those in power responsible for their actions." The defense attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Robert Carson, countered with his own opening statement, painting Officer Harris as a dedicated public servant who had made a split-second decision in a high-pressure situation. "This case is not about race," he argued. "It's about a police officer doing his job to protect the community. Officer Harris acted in good faith, and he should not be punished for that." As the trial progressed, the tension in the courtroom grew. Witnesses were called, evidence was presented, and the jury listened intently. But the most powerful moment came when Marcus took the stand. He spoke softly but clearly, recounting the events of that fateful day and the impact it had on his life. His testimony was raw and emotional, and there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. When it was over, Marcus felt a sense of relief. He had done his part. Now, it was up to the jury to decide. But as the trial entered its final days, it became clear that the case was about more than just Marcus. It was about a community grappling with its own biases, a justice system struggling to confront its flaws, and a nation searching for answers. The outcome of the trial would have far-reaching implications, not just for the Johnsons, but for everyone who believed in the possibility of change. And as the jury prepared to deliberate, the Johnsons held their breath, knowing that their fight was far from over. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed back in after hours of deliberation. The tension was palpable, a heavy weight pressing down on everyone present. Marcus sat between his parents, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears. This was it, the moment they had been waiting for. The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, addressed the jury. "Have you reached a verdict?" The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with a calm expression, stood up. "We have, Your Honor." She handed a piece of paper to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. The room seemed to hold its breath as the judge read the verdict. Finally, she looked up and nodded to the foreperson. "In the case of Marcus Johnson versus Officer Greg Harris and the Maplewood Police Department, we find the defendants guilty of excessive force and racial profiling." The courtroom erupted. Cheers, gasps, and cries of relief filled the air as the Johnsons hugged each other tightly, tears streaming down their faces. Marcus felt a wave of emotions, relief, joy, and a deep sense of vindication. They had won. Justice had been served. "If you don't act now, this town will continue to be divided." The mayor sighed, her gaze shifting to Marcus. "And what about you, young man? What do you think we should do?" Marcus hesitated for a moment, then spoke up. I think we need to stop being afraid of change. It's not going to be easy, but it's the right thing to do. And if we work together, we can make Maplewood a better place for everyone." Mayor Collins studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "You're a remarkable young man, Marcus. And you're right. We do need to stop being afraid. I'll take your demands under serious consideration, and I'll do everything in my power to move this town forward." As the Johnsons left City Hall, they were greeted by a mix of cheers and jeers from the crowd outside. The tension in the air was palpable, but Marcus tried to focus on the positive. They had taken another step forward, and that was something to be proud of. But as they drove home, the reality of their situation began to sink in. The threats and backlash they had faced were a constant reminder of how difficult their fight would be. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table, the conversation turned to the challenges ahead. "We knew this wasn't going to be easy," James said, his voice steady. "But we've come too far to back down now. We got to keep pushing no matter what." Linda nodded, her expression resolute. "We're not just fighting for ourselves anymore. We're fighting for everyone who believes in justice and equality. And that's worth fighting for." Marcus looked around the table at his family, his heart swelling with pride. They had been through so much together, and they had come out stronger on the other side. No matter what challenges lay ahead, he knew they would face them together. In the weeks that followed, the Johnsons continued to work tirelessly to push for change. They organized rallies, spoke at community meetings, and met with local leaders to advocate for their demands. Slowly but surely, they began to see progress. The city council approved funding for new community programs, and the police department implemented additional reforms, including the use of body cameras and mandatory de-escalation training. But the fight was far from over. The opposition to their efforts remained strong, and the threats against them continued. One evening, as Marcus was getting ready for bed, he noticed a strange car parked outside their house. The car sat there for hours, its engine running and its headlights off. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine, but he tried to push the fear aside. The next morning, he told his parents about the car. James immediately called the police, but by the time they arrived, the car was gone. The incident left the family on edge, a stark reminder of the dangers they still faced. Despite the challenges, the Johnsons refused to be silenced. They knew that their fight was bigger than themselves, and they were determined to see it through to the end. As they looked to the future, they felt a glimmer of hope. Change was possible, but it would take time, effort, and unwavering determination. And as they continued to push forward, they knew that they were not alone. They had the support of their community, their allies, and people across the country who believed in their mission. Together, they were building a movement, one that would leave a lasting impact on Maplewood and beyond. The winter months brought a new wave of challenges for the Johnsons. The progress they had fought so hard for was beginning to take root, but the opposition was growing more vocal and aggressive. The threats against the family escalated, and the tension in Maplewood reached a boiling point. One evening, as the family gathered in their living room, there was a loud crash outside. Marcus jumped, his heart racing as he ran to the window. A brick had been thrown through the front window, shattering the glass and sending shards across the floor. Attached to the brick was a note, scrawled in bold, angry letters. "Stop or else." Linda's hands trembled as she picked up the note, her face pale with fear. "This has gone too far," she said, her voice shaking. "We can't keep living like this." James clenched his fists, his jaw tight with anger. "We're not going to let them scare us," he said firmly. "But we need to be smart about this. We can't just ignore these threats." The next morning, the Johnsons met with Sarah Mitchell to discuss their options. Sarah listened carefully, her expression growing more serious as they recounted the recent incidents. "This is harassment, plain and simple," she said. "We need to involve the authorities and take legal action. But we also need to think about your safety. Have you considered relocating, even temporarily?" The idea of leaving their home was a difficult one for the Johnsons. Maplewood was where they had built their lives, where their friends and community were. But as they looked around at the boarded-up window and the fear in Marcus's eyes, they knew they had to consider it. After much discussion, the family decided to stay in Maplewood but take additional precautions. They installed security cameras around their property, hired a private security firm to monitor their home, and worked with local law enforcement to increase patrols in their neighborhood. It wasn't an ideal solution, but it was the best they could do under the circumstances. Meanwhile, the movement they had started continued to gain momentum. People across the country were inspired by Marcus's story, and donations poured in to support their efforts. The Johnsons used the funds to establish a nonprofit organization called Justice for All, which focused on advocating for police reform, supporting victims of racial injustice, and promoting community education. One of the organization's first initiatives was a series of town hall meetings, where community members could come together to discuss issues of race, policing, and accountability. The meetings were often tense, with heated debates and passionate arguments, but they also provided an opportunity for dialogue and understanding. At one such meeting, Marcus stood before a packed room, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I know this isn't easy," he said. "I know that talking about race and injustice can be uncomfortable. But if we don't have these conversations, nothing will ever change. We have to be willing to listen to each other, even when it's hard." The room fell silent as Marcus spoke, his words resonating with everyone present. For the first time in a long time, it felt like there was a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward. But not everyone was willing to listen. The opposition to the Johnsons' efforts remained strong, and the threats against them continued. One night, as Marcus was walking home from a community event, he was approached by a group of men. They surrounded him, their faces hidden by hoods, and began hurling insults and threats. "You think you're so brave?" One of them sneered. "You think you can change things? You're just a kid. You don't know what you're messing with." Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I'm not afraid of you," he said, his voice steady. "You can try to scare me, but you won't stop me." The men hesitated, clearly caught off guard by Marcus's courage. Before they could respond, a car pulled up, and Michael jumped out, his face filled with fury. "Get away from my brother," he shouted, stepping between Marcus and the men. The men backed off, muttering curses under their breath as they disappeared into the night. Marcus felt a surge of gratitude as he looked at his brother. "Thanks, Mike," he said quietly. Michael put an arm around Marcus's shoulders, his expression serious. "We're in this together, little bro. No matter what." As the weeks went by, the Johnsons continued to push forward, despite the challenges they faced. They knew that their fight was far from over, but they also knew that they were making a difference. The town hall meetings were sparking important conversations, The nonprofit was gaining traction, and people across the country were taking notice. But the threats and backlash were a constant reminder of the risks they were taking. One evening, as the family sat down for dinner, they received a phone call from Sarah. Her voice was urgent, her words sending a chill down their spines. "I just got word that there's a planned protest outside your house tomorrow," she said. "It's being organized by a group that's opposed to your work. I'm worried about your safety. We need to come up with a plan." The Johnsons exchanged worried glances, the weight of the situation settling over them. They knew that the protest could turn violent, and they had to be prepared. The next morning, the protesters arrived, their signs and chants filling the air. The Johnsons stayed inside, their security team positioned around the property to ensure their safety. From the window, Marcus watched as the crowd grew larger, their anger and hostility palpable. But then, something unexpected happened. A group of counter-protesters arrived, their signs reading "Justice for Marcus" and "End Racism Now." They formed a protective barrier around the Johnsons' house, their voices rising in solidarity. Marcus felt a lump in his throat as he watched the scene unfold. Despite the fear and uncertainty, he knew that they were not alone. They had allies, people who believed in their mission and were willing to stand with them. As the day wore on, the protest eventually dissipated, leaving the Johnsons exhausted but hopeful. They knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but they also knew that they were making a difference. Together, they were building a movement, one that would leave a lasting impact on Maplewood and beyond. And as they looked to the future, they felt a glimmer of hope. Change was possible, but it would take time, effort, and unwavering determination. They were ready for the fight. The spring brought a sense of renewal to Maplewood, but for the Johnsons, the challenges were far from over. The threats and backlash had taken a toll on the family, but they refused to back down. They had come too far to give up now, and they were determined to see their fight through to the end. One afternoon, Marcus received an unexpected invitation. A national civil rights organization wanted him to speak at their annual conference in Washington, D.C. The event would bring together activists, leaders, and policymakers from across the country, and Marcus would have the opportunity to share his story on a national stage. At first, Marcus was hesitant. The thought of speaking in front of such a large audience was intimidating, but his family encouraged him to take the opportunity. "This is your chance to make a real impact," Linda said, her eyes filled with pride. "You've already inspired so many people. Imagine what you could do on a national stage." Marcus nodded, his resolve strengthening. "You're right," he said. "I'll do it." The day of the conference arrived, and the Johnsons traveled to Washington, D.C. as a family. The event was held in a grand auditorium, filled with thousands of people who had come to hear from some of the most influential voices in the civil rights movement. As Marcus stood backstage, waiting for his turn to speak, he felt a mix of nerves and excitement. When his name was called, Marcus took a deep breath and walked onto the stage. The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing through the auditorium. Marcus looked out at the sea of faces, his heart pounding, but his voice steady. "My name is Marcus Johnson," he began, his words clear and strong. "I'm just a kid from Maplewood, but I've learned that even the smallest voices can make a big difference. What happened to me wasn't just about one police officer or one incident. It was about a system that has failed too many people for too long." The audience listened intently as Marcus shared his story, his words resonating with everyone present. He spoke about the fear he had felt, the pain of being targeted because of the color of his skin, and the courage it had taken to stand up and fight for justice. "But this isn't just my story," Marcus continued. "It's the story of every kid who's ever been treated unfairly because of who they are. It's the story of every family who's had to fight for their rights. And it's the story of everyone who believes in a better future, a future where justice isn't just a word, but a reality for all." The crowd rose to their feet, their applause thunderous as Marcus finished his speech. He felt a surge of pride and hope, knowing that his words had touched so many people. After the conference, the Johnsons were inundated with messages of support from people across the country. Marcus's speech had gone viral, and his story was being shared on social media, in news outlets, and in conversations everywhere. The family knew that they had reached a turning point. Their fight was no longer just about Maplewood. It was about something much bigger. But with the increased attention came new challenges. The threats against the family escalated, and the backlash from their opponents grew more intense. One evening, as they returned home from a community event, they found their house vandalized. The words, "Go home," were spray-painted across the front door, a stark reminder of the hatred they were up against. Linda's hands shook as she stared at the graffiti, her face pale with fear. "This is getting out of control," she said, her voice trembling. "We can't keep living like this." James put an arm around her, his expression grim. "We'll get through this," he said. "We've come too far to let them win." The next morning, the Johnsons held a press conference outside their home. They stood together as a family, their faces filled with determination despite the fear in their hearts. Marcus stepped up to the microphone, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "We're not going to let hate silence us," he said. "What happened to our home is a reminder of why we're fighting. This isn't just about us. It's about everyone who believes in justice and equality. We're not going to back down. We're going to keep fighting, no matter what." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers a powerful reminder of the support the Johnsons had. But as they returned inside, the reality of their situation settled over them. They knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but they also knew that they were making a difference.